What I would say is that we were rather surprised at the performance of the hypersonic missiles that the Russians have employed. We were surprised because they were not just effective in terms of speed, but they were unstoppable and they were accurate and precise. So we know now that they have an arsenal of hypersonic missiles that are very lethal and very effective. They're all carrying high-end explosive conventional warheads, but obviously some of them could carry a nuclear warhead if necessary.
You say unstoppable, you mean that literally?
Yes. In other words, let's put it this way. We have a wonderful set of missiles. We call them Standard missiles. The Standard Missile 3 developed by the Navy is brilliant, and it will shoot down a hypersonic missile if the missile's path is predictable. In other words, if you know that the incoming missile is going to follow a precise trajectory, you can coordinate and calculate the intercept. The problem is that the hypersonic missiles the Russians are employing do not always follow a precise trajectory that is predictable. As a result, if it's not predictable, you can't hit it. It's just moving too quickly. Thus far, President Putin has exercised enormous restraint. Thus far, he's held 300,000 Russian combat troops in reserve. He's kept only the forces necessary forward in defensive positions. He has held troops in reserve also in Belarus. And he has allowed the Ukrainians, simply because it worked to his advantage, to destroy themselves in attack after attack after attack. The Ukrainians have now effectively run out of manpower. They have almost nothing left. Every time they talk about having broken through somewhere or advanced, it's been a lie, completely untrue, carried by all the Western news media. So at this point in time, the Ukrainians are turning exclusively to long-range strike weapons that they can get from the British and us and potentially the Germans and French. And we saw that there were 11 Storm Shadow missiles fired by the Ukrainians against Russian targets. Of the 11, 3 managed to escape destruction. The other 8 were shot down by the integrated air defenses. And those found targets in the harbor at Sevastopol. At the same time, the British provided unmanned underwater systems, in other words, underwater drones or surface drones, to attack the harbor from the ocean side. Those things had an effect. They effectively destroyed a submarine. That submarine is probably not going to be repaired. It'll probably be effectively junked. And then 2 other surface ships that probably will be repaired in time, although there's no repair facility in the Black Sea for them. But the truth is, this war is not going to be won or lost on the basis of attacks on the harbor in Crimea. It's not going to be won or lost on the basis of any long-range attacks on targets inside Russia. It's going to be won or lost on the ground in Ukraine. The question now is, will the Russians finally say enough is enough? We can't go on anymore. We have to end this ourselves and act. That's the question.
Do you have a feel for how much longer this goes on?
I think this could go on to Christmas. It could even drag into next year unless the Russians act. They have the force, they have the capability, the Ukrainians have nothing to stop them. And they know that this will not end until they go to the Dnieper River and cross it. They're going to have to cross that river. They're going to eventually have to take Odessa, and they're going to have to enter Kiev. I've had more than one Russian general quoted to me by sources on the ground over there say, this war will not end until our tanks are driving down the main street of Kiev. So I think they understand that. The problem is that President Putin is concerned about 2 things. Number one, he doesn't want to do something that he thinks will precipitate U.S.-led intervention in Western Ukraine. He does not want a war with us. He doesn't want a war with NATO. Secondly, he wants to end this war in a way that will allow everybody to eventually do business together. In other words, put the war behind us and get on with normal life. He's trying very hard to avoid the kind of destructive action that would make that impossible. We, on the other hand, are doing everything in our power to make sure there can never be any sort of normal relationship between the United States and Europe and Russia. He doesn't seem to understand that. He's got to understand that. And that's what most of his commanders in the field know. And their view is, if you want to stop these long-range strikes, then let us go. Let us attack. And let us crush these Ukrainians once and for all.
Colonel Macgregor, thank you very much. Over the weekend, we hit 200,000 subscriptions on this show, in large measure because of all of your generous, informed, and so well-received appearances. Thank you again for all your time, Colonel. We'll see you again soon.
I thought it was all the great jokes that you and I traded. I'm really... I keep trying to think of something positive that we can say that'll move us down the road towards something better. But unfortunately, we're not, as you saw with President Biden, we're not left much choice. And I don't think President Biden is really in charge. I think he's doing what they tell him to do. I think he's reading whatever he's given. And I wish that the people behind him would recognize that the longer this lasts, the more dangerous it becomes. And at some point, the Russians are going to lose patience. And we need to get out of the way. We have nothing at stake in Ukraine. Ukraine is not some sort of gleaming, shining city of liberal democracy on the hill. Far from it. It's much closer to Stalinist Russia. And the Russians are not evil. They're simply trying to protect themselves against what they thought would be an existential threat to them posed by us, because we would put our missiles in eastern Ukraine. So we need to come down and understand these things, and we can end this war. But the map will change. Territory will be exchanged. End of discussion. But what about the millions of Ukrainians who are living in Western Europe and around the world? How do we get them back to Ukraine if we do not end this? Well, remember, we'd end up with all of these U.S. forces isolated, without reinforcement, without adequate sustainment, without support. What are the Europeans going to do? What have they got to send? Very little. The only force right now in the neighborhood that's even remotely capable is Polish. So you put the Polish forces together with our own, and that still pales before what the Russians can field against us.
Right.
And we're not going to get across the Atlantic because of something called Russian submarines. So you can't reinforce as we did during World War II. And everybody forgets that it took us 3-4 years to defeat the German submarine threat so that we could move across the Atlantic. Be much worse now. So no one seems to be thinking strategically. Everyone is thinking about what is politically appealing. We have a wish list, not a strategy.
Today, in this kind of big speech that everyone's talking about, that Ukraine has lost 71,000 soldiers during this counteroffensive that achieved nothing. What do you make of that? 71,000 soldiers killed just during the counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side. Do those numbers sound accurate to you?
Well, they're certainly plausible because about 4 weeks ago, literally a month ago, we counted over 60,000 dead. And that's based on satellite photography, looking at bodies lying on the ground, looking at cemeteries that are filling up, and also receiving reports from on the ground inside Ukraine about the masses of dead and horribly wounded people. So I think it's plausible. Can I confirm it? I can't. But I would say that the Russians have been far, far closer to the truth when they report casualties than the Ukrainians have.
General Mark Milley is saying that this time is running out here. He basically says that we've seen some gains, or some good progress here. And he said, I said at the very beginning of this that this was going to be long, slow, hard, high casualty producing. That's exactly what it is. But he thinks that there's confidence. He has a lot of confidence that, Ukraine is going to break through in the next 45 days or so before the bad weather sets in. What do you make of Mark Milley's comments?
Well, setting aside whether or not anybody wants to listen to Mark Milley, I haven't heard the truth from that man's mouth for years. He's the ultimate political puppet. And that's, of course, what the current swamp administration in Washington wants. Someone who goes along, questions nothing, and supports the status quo. Milley is a fraud, so I would just forget anything he says. The truth of the matter is as follows. The counteroffensive has been a catastrophe. Whether it's 71,000 or 69,000, I don't know. It doesn't make any difference. The equipment losses are horrendous. And all of this is for various reasons. Number one, Ukrainian forces are trained to fight like NATO. NATO, and especially the United States Armed Forces, are organized to refight some version of World War II. And we're up against a 21st century military establishment, which is organized very differently. And no one has been willing to accept this reality. And that's the biggest problem. Right now, you have persistent surveillance all over Ukraine, from space-based assets down to terrestrial assets that allow the Russians, through their intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, to see everything in Ukraine all of the time. We have not disrupted their satellite-based capabilities for the simple reason that if we do that, they will destroy ours. We don't want to lose ours. So it's been a game. We try to race information to the Ukrainians as quickly as possible that they can exploit, but they're not organized to exploit it. The Russians are simply organized in a way that maximizes the value of their strike assets. Strike assets, artillery, rockets, missiles, drones, you name it. And these are very plentiful on the Russian side. The Russians have always appreciated the criticality of maintaining large quantities of strike weapons. They've got them in practically limitless numbers. You link those to all of these overhead surveillance capabilities, and then you have an automatic warfare capability. Something moves towards your lines, something seems to be threatening, a group of Ukrainians assemble, they bring in additional equipment, it's all detected, it's targeted, and then at a time and a place that is convenient for the Russians, they are destroyed. We failed to come to terms with this reality. People say, well, this is starting to look like World War I. Well, it's much worse than World War I. In World War I, people still didn't know what was happening behind the other person's trench line. Today, the Russians know exactly what's going on in Ukraine. And they've decided to simply sit and let the Ukrainians impale themselves. The question is, how much longer do they sit? And I can tell you there are large numbers of senior officers in Moscow, senior Russian officers, and a lot of Russian political leaders who are extremely uncomfortable with Putin's determination to, for the moment, wait. Putin has been very deliberate and very cautious. People have had it in Moscow. They say, come on, President Putin, it's time to end this thing. Crush these people, get it over with. And their point is very simple. If they don't do that, their concern is that we will be tempted to do something stupid, like intervene in Western Ukraine, or simply give the Ukrainians more capability, which is, of course, what we're doing. Now, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to change the direction of the war. But the point is, if you do nothing for as long as the Russians have, in other words, simply sit behind your defenses, annihilate your enemy, as attractive as that is, people begin to wonder, well, I guess the Russians can't attack. What's wrong with them? Why don't they attack? Well, it's a deliberate decision by President Putin. He does not want a war with us. And he's afraid that if he rapidly advances on Kiev, closes the gap between his forces and the Dnieper River, that we will interpret that as threatening and suddenly intervene. I think he's wrong. I think our opportunity to intervene is over. And I think behind the scenes, the American military establishment and the other military establishments in NATO know they cannot defeat this capability which the Russians have perfected. We're still organized for a form of warfare that is anachronistic. It's called World War II.
You write a new piece in the American Conservative, a new opinion piece out called War, Money, and America's Future, Why the Uniparty Risking a War We're So Ill-Prepared to Fight. Why is the Uniparty risking a war we're so ill-prepared to fight? And what is the NATO-U.S. strategy then? If we're bleeding Europe to death, crushing them under sanctions by trying to place these sanctions against Russia. Europe is being crushed. The United States is being crushed. We could hit double-digit interest rates on the real estate front of the United States, wages continuing to decline, and unemployment continuing to go up on the United States side. So what is Washington's proxy war endgame here? Is it to just sit and continue to funnel money and weapons into this war zone in perpetuity? Or do they actually have an end game?
Well, remember that the original purpose of this entire operation was to bleed Russia to death. No, right. It was to harm their economy, wear them out, exhaust their resources. Well, that was absurd. And the opposite has happened. Our resources are being exhausted. Right now, we know, and I'm sure you saw this in the article, and this is something a lot of Americans need to understand, that the amount of money it takes us to service the debt is now equal to our defense budget, roughly $1 trillion. How much longer can you do this? And I think that's something else that Putin, who is an economist, remember the man has a doctorate in economics, he's been watching this, and I think he's been betting heavily that not only America's economy or financial system is going to go into crisis, but I think he's expecting the Europeans to simply slide into recession or depression or worse, and that will bring an end to this conflict, at which point in time he can advance without much opposition. I mean, we already know the Ukrainians have no more manpower, per se. I mean, they've turned to the European Union, they've turned to the various governments in NATO and said, we want you to repatriate military-age males from all over your countries back to the Ukraine so that we can feed them into the meat grinder and kill them as well. I don't know how that's going to turn out. I was really depressed when I discovered that the Irish Republic had agreed to do it. But I think in Poland and other countries, there's a reluctance to do that because they feel they may face armed opposition inside their own countries from Ukrainians that say, no, I'm not going back. I'm not prepared to die. So I think we've already hit the end game. The question is, as you put it, what are we going to do? And Newland and Blinken apparently flew off recently and said, oh, let's freeze the conflict. Well, that's a non-starter. The Russians have been telling us for months, forget it. They're not going to do that.
What does that mean, freeze the conflict? What does that entail?
Well, I think what they believe it entails is something like a divided Korea, that you come to some sort of agreement along the line of contact and you say, we'll stay on this side, you stay on that side. They see it in the West, particularly in Washington, as a face-saving measure. The Russians aren't going to do it. What the Russians will not accept is any Ukrainian state of any kind that is aligned with NATO. Number one, can't happen.
Right.
Otherwise, they fought this war for no purpose. Remember, this is all about the existential threat that we present inside Ukraine to Russia. So that's out of the question. And the issue is, how do you turn to the Russians if you're in Washington, in front of the American people and in front of your allies and say, look, we were wrong. You aren't weak. And we've got serious problems at home. We've got to pack it in, go home and take care of our own problems. Well, in their minds, they've just been defeated. They've admitted that they have to surrender and walk away. So in Washington, to get back to your original question, what are you going to do? You just double down and continue to do the stupid things that have failed utterly to produce any success. So send them more ATACMS missiles, send them German Taurus missiles, send whatever somebody else has got out there, especially since you know they don't have any troops to speak of. So send them long-range attack weapons that only require a few trained people, and then let them launch them to their heart's content at the Russians. And of course, again, they're going to attack Russian civilians in Russian towns and cities. We know that. They've done that before. This is insane. This is crazy, but that's where we are.
I'll get you out of here on this, Colonel, which is, again, this 45-day weather window that General Milley mentioned, 30 to 45 days or so. What happens, do you believe, in this 45 days on the Russian side? And what happens after that 45-day window closes?
Well, that's the question that none of us can actually answer to our satisfaction. And that's what I said at the beginning. I was talking to some friends in Europe that just returned from Moscow, and they're very well connected. They're actually in the journalistic community, and they said that in talking to senior Russian officials as well as senior military men on the general staff, the Russian attitude is, look, let's get this over with. Please, President Putin, let us attack. They've got 300,000 troops in reserve. It's not as though they don't have the capability to launch. And again, President Putin has chosen to wait. I think he truly believes that the situation in Europe will get so bad that NATO will simply crumble. People will simply say, well, we followed you as far as we can, Washington, and you've led us down the path to hell. Germany is being deindustrialized. One of the leading CEOs of one of the biggest chemical companies in Germany, and remember, these are industries that lead the world in many capabilities, has said, it's over. We're shutting down. We're being deindustrialized. So I think Putin has said, well, why don't we wait for Europeans to wake up, French and Germans particularly? But there is a fight in Moscow. It's not a fight in the sense that we would understand it, where people are yelling and screaming at each other. But behind the scenes, there is a big debate. Why wait? Let's get it over with. And Putin has been reluctant to do that for the reasons that we've outlined. So nobody really knows the answer at this point to your question.
If you were in a bizarro world, if you happened to be an advisor to President Putin, if it were, again, a bizarro world or an alternative dimension, and you were giving advice to Putin whether to sit back and wait, watch Europe crumble, the United States crumble, or to take action and launch these 300,000, what would you do as a military advisor?
Well, a lot of people ask me that question. I don't care to go to jail as a traitor to the American people. So I'm not going to advise President Putin, plus the fact he's done pretty well. I mean, the Russian casualties have been very low. His force is in excellent shape. He's coming out of this smelling like a rose. So I really think it's up to him. And he hasn't done badly. He's done very, very well. We're the ones who are in serious trouble. And the real issue is, what do we do? We've talked in the past about the border. The border is open. We don't know who's coming in there. Millions of people are pouring in. They're not an asset to us. They're going to be a burden to us. It's only a question of how much longer before we have an explosion inside the United States. I'm sure that President Putin is aware of that as well. So the situation in the West is terrible. And under those circumstances, it may be prudent for him to do what he's done, but he does have pressure on him. I can't advise him. And I imagine there are a lot of people that say, well, I'd like Putin to do X, but he's done pretty well thus far. And so I probably ought to shut up and color until something goes horribly wrong, but I don't think it will.